The Mountain Executioners. The Tolliver clan butchered 21. Revenue men over confiscated moonshine. The most coordinated campaign of vengeance in Appalachian history and the most devastating demonstration that attacking a mountain clan meant attacking an army, when an entire family united to butcher every revenue agent who had participated in a raid that left their patriarch dead and 3 children starved, their methods as brutal as the mountains that sheltered them. This is the true story of the Mountain Executioners. Our story begins in the remote mountain section of Rowan County, Kentucky, in the heart of the eastern coalfields, during the violent years of the 1890s, when feuds had made the region synonymous with bloodshed, and when the federal government's attempts to enforce revenue laws had created conflicts that neither side could win. The mountains rise here in great folds of sandstone and ancient rock, their hollows sheltering families who had lived according to their own laws since before Kentucky was a state, who had never accepted the authority of a government they viewed as foreign and hostile, who maintained bonds of kinship that outsiders could not comprehend. You see, in Rowan County during the years of our story, the moonshine trade that the federal government was determined to eliminate was not merely an illegal business, but was the economic foundation upon which entire communities depended. The legitimate economy offered nothing to mountain families whose land was too rocky for profitable farming, and whose skills had no market value in the industrial world that was transforming America. Moonshine was survival itself, the conversion of corn that could not be sold into whiskey that could be, the transformation of poverty into something approaching sustainability. The family at the center of our story was the Tolliver clan, a kinship network that had occupied the upper reaches of Triplet Creek for 4 generations, that had grown through births and marriages until it numbered more than 60 souls living in a compound of cabins that functioned as a single economic and social unit. The Tollivers were not unusual by the standards of mountain families, were distinguished only by their numbers and by the unity that generations of shared hardship had forged among them. That's right. The Tolliver clan in 1892 was led by a patriarch named Ezekiel Tolliver, a man of 63 years whose authority over his extended family was absolute, and whose wisdom had guided them through decades of challenges that would have destroyed less cohesive groups. Ezekiel had been born in the cabin where he still lived, had married a woman named Martha, who had borne him 12 children, had watched those children marry and produce grandchildren until the hollow that bore his family's name contained more Tollivers than any census could accurately count. Ezekiel was a man whose appearance reflected the life he had lived, tall and lean with a white beard that reached to his chest, hands that were gnarled from decades of labor, but that still possessed the strength to perform any task the farm required. His eyes were sharp despite his age, missing nothing that happened within his domain, seeing through deceptions that younger men might have accepted. His voice was soft, his manner gentle, but everyone who knew him understood that his gentleness was a choice rather than a limitation, that he was capable of violence that his peaceful demeanor did not suggest. The moonshine operation that supported the Tolliver clan was substantial by any standard, the accumulated investment of 4 generations, producing whiskey in quantities that few family operations could match. The Tollivers maintained 3 stills in locations scattered throughout their hollow, each capable of producing 50 gallons per week, the combined output supplying buyers throughout eastern Kentucky and beyond. The quality of Tolliver whiskey was legendary, the result of techniques refined over decades, and of water that flowed from springs whose purity could not be replicated elsewhere. The stills themselves represented an investment that had accumulated over generations, copper and equipment that had been purchased piece by piece as the operation expanded, each generation adding to what the previous generation had built. The largest still was capable of producing a run of exceptional purity, its design incorporating improvements that the family had developed through trial and error over nearly a century. The loss of these stills would not merely interrupt production, but would eliminate infrastructure that could not be quickly replaced. The operation was managed collectively, each branch of the family contributing labor according to its capabilities and receiving compensation according to its needs. The young men tended the stills and ran the whiskey to buyers who came from as far as Lexington. The women prepared the corn and managed the fermentation that preceded distillation. The children helped where they could, learning the trade that would support them when they reached adulthood. The elderly provided wisdom and oversight, ensuring that the techniques that had been perfected over generations were properly transmitted to those who would carry them forward. The division of labor reflected the family's understanding that survival required contribution from every member according to ability. No one was exempt from work that needed doing. No one received more than their share of what the operation produced. The equality extended across gender and age, the family's culture recognizing that everyone's contribution was essential and that everyone's needs were equally valid. This collective approach had allowed the Tollivers to thrive where isolated individuals might have failed. The revenue that the Moonshine provided was not wealth by any external standard, but was survival for a family that had no other options. The money purchased the goods that the hollow could not produce: salt and sugar and coffee, cloth for clothing that could not be made from what the land provided, tools and equipment that farming and distilling required. Without the Moonshine income, the Tollivers would have faced the same desperate poverty that was driving other mountain families from their land, would have been forced to seek wage labor in the coal mines that were beginning to transform the region. The children of the Tolliver clan numbered more than 20 in 1892, ranging from infants to teenagers, who were already contributing to the family's operations. 3 of these children would become central to the story that followed: Samuel, who was 7 years old, Mary, who was 5, and Thomas, who was 3. These were the children of Ezekiel's youngest son, James, and his wife, Sarah, a young couple who had built their cabin at the edge of the family compound and who had begun raising a family of their own. The events that would transform the Tolliver clan from moonshiners to executioners began in the autumn of 1892, when a new revenue agent arrived in Rowan County with a determination to eliminate illegal distilling that exceeded anything the region had previously experienced. This agent was named Vernon Crawford, a man whose hatred of moonshiners had been cultivated through personal tragedy when his father had died from drinking contaminated whiskey, and whose approach to enforcement reflected a desire for vengeance that went far beyond any legitimate law enforcement purpose. Crawford brought with him a team of 20 agents whose selection had been based on their willingness to employ whatever methods their leader directed. These were not career revenue officers, but were men hired specifically for the aggressive campaign that Crawford intended to conduct, men whose previous experience included work as strikebreakers and private security forces, men who understood that their assignment involved violence that ordinary enforcement would not require. The intelligence that led Crawford to the Tolliver operation came from sources that the family never identified, information that was detailed and accurate, and that suggested betrayal by someone who knew the hollow intimately. The informant had provided maps of still locations, schedules of production, descriptions of the security measures that the family employed. Crawford approached the raid with a thoroughness that this intelligence allowed, planned an operation that would not merely seize the stills, but would destroy the Tolliver clan's capacity for continued production. The raid came on the morning of November 15, 1892, in the pre-dawn hours, when Crawford believed the hollow would be least defended. His 21 agents approached through routes that the informant had identified, avoided the watch points that the family had established, reached the compound before any alarm could be raised. The approach demonstrated both Crawford's planning and the completeness of the betrayal that had made it possible. The violence that followed exceeded anything that legitimate enforcement might have required. The agents did not merely seize the stills, but destroyed everything they found, smashed equipment that represented years of investment, burned buildings that had housed generations of Tolliver operations. They did not merely confiscate the whiskey, but destroyed the corn and the mash and the stored supplies that would have allowed production to resume, eliminated not only the current operation, but the capacity to begin again. The family members who resisted were beaten with a brutality that went beyond any necessity of subduing them. Young men who tried to protect the stills were clubbed into unconsciousness. Women who screamed at the destruction were struck until they fell silent. The violence was systematic and deliberate, designed not merely to enable the seizure, but to punish the family for their illegal activity and to discourage any thought of resumption. Ezekiel Tolliver himself confronted Crawford as the destruction reached its peak, the patriarch emerging from his cabin to face the man who was destroying everything his family had built. The confrontation that followed was witnessed by dozens of family members whose accounts would later provide the details that history has preserved. "You have no right to do this," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had never accepted that government writ extended to his hollow. "This is our land and our business, and you have no right to destroy what we have built." Crawford's response was a blow that struck Ezekiel across the face, the revenue agent's pistol splitting the old man's cheek and sending him staggering backward. The blow was followed by others, Crawford and his agents beating the patriarch with a fury that seemed disconnected from any law enforcement purpose, continuing the assault even after Ezekiel fell and could no longer resist. The beating continued for several minutes, the agents taking turns striking an old man whose only crime had been defending his family's livelihood. When they finally stopped, Ezekiel lay motionless in the dirt of the compound he had led for 40 years, his white beard stained with blood, his body broken in ways that even his family's considerable knowledge of healing could not repair. He died 3 days later, his injuries too severe for recovery, his last words a command to his sons that they remember what had been done and that they respond as the mountain code required. The patriarch's death transformed the Tolliver clan's grief into something colder and more purposeful, united them in a determination for vengeance that would not be satisfied until every agent who had participated in the raid had paid with his life. But the raid's consequences extended beyond Ezekiel's death. The destruction of the Moonshine operation had eliminated the family's income at the beginning of winter, had left more than 60 people without the resources that survival required. The stored food that should have sustained the family through the cold months had been damaged or contaminated during the raid. The destruction extending beyond the Moonshine operation to affect supplies that had nothing to do with illegal distilling. The winter of 1892–93 was one of the harshest in Kentucky memory. Temperatures dropping below zero for weeks at a time, snow accumulating to depths that made travel impossible. Conditions that would have challenged families with adequate provisions, and that proved devastating to a family whose supplies had been destroyed. The Tollivers rationed what they had, shared equally among all members regardless of age, watched as the inadequate nutrition began to take its toll on those least able to withstand deprivation. The children suffered first, their smaller bodies unable to maintain the reserves that adult bodies could provide. Samuel, the 7-year-old, developed a cough in January that progressed to pneumonia by February, his weakened immune system unable to fight an infection that a properly nourished child might have survived. The cough began as something minor, the kind of illness that mountain children often developed in winter and that usually passed without serious consequence. But Samuel's body had no reserves to draw upon, no stored energy that could fuel the immune response that fighting the infection required. His parents watched helplessly as the cough deepened, as his breathing became labored, as the color drained from his face and his energy diminished day by day. The family's healers applied every remedy they knew, herbs and poultices and treatments that had saved other children in other winters, but nothing they tried could compensate for the fundamental problem. Samuel's body was starving, was consuming itself to stay alive, had nothing left to fight the infection that was colonizing his lungs. The boy became too weak to leave his bed by mid-February, spent his days drifting between consciousness and a sleep that provided no rest. His mother sat with him constantly, held his hand, told him stories about the spring that was coming and the food they would have when the weather warmed. The stories were lies, and both of them knew it, but the pretense of hope was all she could offer when hope itself had been destroyed. He died on February 23, 1893, his small body wrapped in quilts that could not provide the warmth that food would have given him, his mother holding him as his breathing stopped. His final words were a request to see his father, who had been out searching for any food that might save his children, who returned to find his oldest son already gone. The grief that James Tolliver felt in that moment would fuel everything that followed. Mary followed 3 weeks later, the 5-year-old succumbing to the same progression of illness that had taken her brother. She had watched Samuel die, had understood in her child's way that something terrible was happening, had asked her mother questions about death that no 5-year-old should have needed to ask. The illness that took her was different from Samuel's, but had the same underlying cause: a body too weakened by hunger to fight off infections that healthy children would have survived. Her death came quietly in the night, while her parents slept beside her, exhausted from the vigil they had maintained through days of watching their daughter fade. They woke to find her still and cold, her small body having surrendered sometime in the darkness. Another victim of the starvation that the raid had imposed, another death that could be traced directly to the men who had destroyed the family's means of survival. James Tolliver dug his daughter's grave beside his son's, the frozen ground yielding only to the fury that he channeled through the pickaxe that no grief could stop. Thomas, the youngest at 3, died in April, just as the weather was beginning to warm, and the family was beginning to hope that the worst had passed. His death was perhaps the most bitter, coming so close to the spring that might have saved him, his small body simply giving up after months of inadequate nutrition. He had watched both his siblings die, had been too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to know that something terrible had taken them away. His final days were spent in a lethargy that his parents found more terrible than struggle would have been, a surrender that reflected a body that had nothing left to give. His parents buried him beside his siblings in the family cemetery, 3 small graves that testified to what the revenue agents had accomplished. The funeral was attended by every member of the Tolliver clan, 60 people standing in silence as the smallest coffin was lowered into the ground. The grief that filled the hollow that day was transforming, even as it was expressed, becoming something harder and colder, something that would not rest until it had achieved the response that the Mountain Code demanded. The deaths of the 3 children completed the transformation that Ezekiel's death had begun. The Tolliver clan was no longer merely grieving, but was united in a determination for vengeance that superseded every other consideration. The 4 deaths, the patriarch and the 3 children, demanded response according to a code that the mountain people had followed for generations, a code that the legal system's failure to provide justice made all the more compelling. The planning began immediately after Thomas's burial, the surviving members of the clan gathering to discuss how the vengeance would be achieved. The discussion was led by Ezekiel's sons, 4 men whose grief for their father was compounded by fury at what had been done to their family, whose capabilities for violence had been demonstrated in feuds that had marked the region's history. The eldest son, also named Ezekiel, but called Little Zeke to distinguish him from his father, was 40 years old, a man whose size and strength made him formidable in any physical confrontation, whose experience in the family's operations made him the natural leader now that his father was gone. The second son, Thomas, was 38, quieter than his brother, but equally capable, whose skill with weapons was known throughout the county. The third son, James, was 35, the father of the 3 children who had starved, whose grief gave him a personal stake in the vengeance that exceeded even what the others felt. The fourth son, William, was 32, the youngest, but perhaps the most intelligent, whose planning abilities would prove essential to the campaign that followed. The method they chose reflected both the crime that had been committed against them and the capabilities that their family possessed. The agents had destroyed their livelihood and caused their family members to die slowly, through deprivation and illness that had taken weeks to claim their victims. The Tollivers would not kill the agents quickly, but would make them suffer, would ensure that each man experienced something of what Samuel and Mary and Thomas had experienced in their final weeks. But they would also make the deaths brutal in ways that simple starvation could not achieve. They were mountain men, skilled in the butchering of livestock and game, possessed of knowledge about how bodies came apart that their years of hunting and farming had provided. They would butcher the agents as they might butcher hogs, would process the men who had caused their children to starve with the same techniques they had applied to animals. The campaign would require patience and coordination that only a large family could provide. The 21 agents who had participated in the raid had scattered after completing their work, some remaining in the region for continued enforcement, others returning to homes in other counties or other states. The Tollivers would need to locate each one, would need to reach them wherever they had gone, would need to execute the killings in ways that could not be traced back to the family until the work was complete. The intelligence network that the Moonshine trade had required was redirected toward the new purpose. Buyers who had purchased Tolliver whiskey for years became sources of information about revenue agent movements. Relatives who had married into other families became conduits for reports about agents who had settled in other regions. Travelers who passed through Tolliver territory were questioned about anything they might have seen or heard. Within weeks, the family had located all 21 agents, had documented their routines and their vulnerabilities, had begun planning the operations that would claim their lives. The first killing came 6 weeks after Thomas's burial, on the night of May 28, 1893. The target was a man named Dale Tackett, one of the agents who had personally beaten Ezekiel during the raid, whose participation in the patriarch's death made him a priority target. Tackett had remained in Rowan County for continued enforcement work, was living in a boarding house in Moorhead, was accessible in ways that agents who had returned to other regions were not. The killing was a family operation from the beginning. Little Zeke led a team of 4 men that included 2 of his brothers and 2 cousins, all of them armed with the knives and tools that their butchering experience had made familiar. They approached Tackett's boarding house in the darkness, waited until he emerged for the outhouse that served the building's residents, seized him before he could cry out or resist. The butchering that followed was conducted in a barn that the family had identified for the purpose, a location far enough from any habitation that Tackett's screams would not be heard. The barn had been prepared in advance, hooks installed from the rafters, tables arranged for the work that would be performed, tools laid out with the precision that the family's livestock processing had always required. The preparation reflected both the seriousness of what they intended and the professionalism with which they would approach it. Tackett was conscious when they began, was made to understand exactly what was happening and why. Little Zeke stood before him, holding a knife whose edge had been honed to a sharpness that could slice through flesh with minimal pressure, and explained in detail what the family intended to do and how long they intended to take doing it. "You helped kill my father," Little Zeke said, his voice soft but carrying clearly in the barn's darkness. "You helped destroy our food. 3 children starved because of what you did. You're going to feel something of what they felt. You're going to understand what it means to die slowly, knowing that no one is coming to help you." They kept him alive as long as they could, inflicted damage that was designed to cause maximum suffering before death finally came, applied techniques that their years of livestock processing had refined. The work required skill that the family possessed in abundance, knowledge of anatomy that allowed them to cause pain without causing the rapid death that less careful work might have produced. The details of what they did were never fully documented, the accounts that survived suggesting practices too extreme for official records to preserve. The work took 2 days, the family members working in shifts, ensuring that Tackett remained conscious for as much of the process as possible. When death finally came, it was almost a mercy, an end to suffering that had exceeded anything the man could have imagined. The family felt no guilt at what they had done, only satisfaction that the first payment had been made on a debt that had 20 more installments. Tackett's body was found 3 days later, what remained of it left at a crossroads where it would be discovered quickly and where its condition would send a message that no one could misinterpret. The body had been butchered in the most literal sense, processed as the family might have processed a hog, reduced to components that were arranged to communicate the contempt that the killers felt for their victim. The discovery produced headlines throughout the state, the brutality of the killing attracting attention that ordinary murders would not have received. The investigation that followed focused immediately on the Tolliver clan, the motive obvious to anyone who knew the history, the method consistent with the family's known skills. But proving the connection was another matter entirely. The Tollivers had alibis provided by family members whose testimony could not be broken, had disposed of evidence with a thoroughness that left nothing for investigators to find, had constructed a wall of silence that no interrogation could penetrate. The second killing came 3 weeks later, another agent butchered in circumstances that echoed Tackett's death. This victim, Robert Lawson, had been one of those who had destroyed the family's food supplies during the raid, whose actions had contributed directly to the starvation that had killed the 3 children. His body was found in a condition that matched Tackett's, processed with the same butchering techniques, left in a location designed to ensure discovery. That's right. The Tolliver clan continued their campaign through the summer of 1893, claiming victims with a regularity that reflected their patience and their coordination. The third killing came in June, the fourth in July, each following the same pattern. An agent seized, transported to a location where the butchering could be conducted without interruption, processed over hours or days, that extracted maximum suffering before death. The remains left where they would be found, and where their condition would communicate the message the family intended. The pattern was unmistakable, the connection to the raid undeniable, but prosecution remained impossible. The Tollivers operated with a discipline that their Moonshine business had developed, each killing a coordinated operation involving multiple family members who provided both manpower and alibis. The wall of silence extended beyond the family to include neighbors and business associates who had their own reasons to protect the clan from federal interference. The fifth and sixth killings came within a single week, the pace accelerating as the family grew more confident in their methods. These victims were agents who had returned to other counties after the raid, were tracked and reached through the extended network that the Tollivers had developed, were killed with the same brutality that had characterized the earlier deaths. The message was clear. Distance provided no protection. Relocation offered no safety. Every agent who had participated in the raid would eventually be found. The seventh killing was one of the most brutal of the campaign. The victim was Crawford's second in command, a man named William Howard, whose particular cruelty during the raid had been noted by multiple witnesses. Howard had personally set fire to the building where the Tollivers stored their corn supplies, had laughed while family members tried to salvage what they could, had contributed to the food shortage that would kill 3 children. The family took special care with Howard, kept him alive longer than any previous victim, ensured that his final hours were memorable in their agony. The 8th, 9th, and 10th killings came in rapid succession, the family's campaign reaching a pace that the investigation could not match. Agents who had believed themselves safe began to understand that they were being hunted systematically, began to flee to other states and other regions, began to request protection that the federal government was increasingly reluctant to provide. The Prohibition Bureau found itself losing agents faster than it could replace them, the campaign against the Tollivers becoming a disaster that no official response could address. The 11th through 15th killings occurred between October and December of 1893, each following the established pattern, each adding to the toll that was decimating the enforcement apparatus of eastern Kentucky. The federal government sent additional investigators, offered rewards for information leading to arrests, applied every resource it could muster to stopping the slaughter. Nothing worked. The Tollivers operated with an efficiency that reflected generations of experience in evading federal authority, disappeared into terrain that no investigation could effectively cover, emerged only to claim another victim before vanishing again. The 16th killing came in January of 1894, the anniversary of Samuel's death, the timing deliberate in ways that everyone who knew the story understood. The victim was an agent who had been present when the food supplies were destroyed, whose participation in the raid had contributed to the starvation that had killed the first of the 3 children. His body was left at the cemetery where Samuel was buried, arranged beside the child's grave in a tableau that communicated meaning no words could express. The 17th and 18th killings came in February and March, each marking an anniversary that the family would not let pass without response. Mary's death was commemorated with a killing, Thomas's death with another, the pattern making clear that the family's grief was being transmuted into vengeance with a precision that matched date to victim. And then there was only Crawford himself, the leader who had ordered the raid, who had personally beaten Ezekiel to death, who bore ultimate responsibility for everything that had followed. Crawford had long since fled Kentucky, had sought refuge in other states where he believed the Tollivers could not reach him, had surrounded himself with protection that he hoped would prevent the fate that had claimed 20 of his men. The 3 remaining agents besides Crawford were killed in April of 1894, quick operations that cleared the field for the final target, that ensured no one would be left alive who had participated in the raid, except the man who had ordered it. The killings were conducted simultaneously by 3 teams operating in 3 different states, a coordination that demonstrated the family's reach and that communicated to Crawford that his protection was meaningless. The killing of Vernon Crawford was the most elaborate operation of the entire campaign, a multi-week effort that involved family members traveling across state lines, establishing surveillance positions, waiting for the opportunity that the family's patience would eventually provide. Crawford was living in Ohio, had hired personal guards, had varied his routine to prevent the predictability that ambush required. None of it mattered. The operation involved more than a dozen family members, some tasked with surveillance, others with logistics, still others with the actual seizure. William, the youngest of Ezekiel's sons and the planner of the campaign, had coordinated every detail with a precision that reflected both his intelligence and his hatred. The guards that Crawford had hired were dealt with first, incapacitated through methods that left them alive but unable to interfere, the family having decided that only those who had participated in the raid deserved death. Crawford was taken from his bed, while his guards slept drugged sleep in their quarters, was bound and gagged before he could cry out, was transported in a wagon whose contents no one would think to question. The journey from Ohio to Kentucky took 3 days. Crawford kept alive and conscious throughout, forced to contemplate what was coming, with every mile that brought him closer to the hollow where his crimes had begun. The family reached Crawford on the night of May 28, 1894, exactly 1 year after the first killing, the timing completing a symmetry that the community would recognize. They took him from his bed while his guards slept, transported him across state lines to Kentucky, brought him to the hollow where his raid had begun the sequence of events that had claimed so many lives. The butchering of Vernon Crawford was conducted in the barn where the first victim had died, the location chosen deliberately to complete the circle that the campaign had described. Every surviving adult member of the Tolliver clan participated, each taking a turn with the knives and tools that had become the instruments of family justice, each contributing to a death that was designed to match the suffering that Crawford had caused. The scene in the barn was illuminated by lanterns, whose light revealed the faces of those who had come to witness and participate. James Tolliver, the father of the 3 starved children, took the first cut, drew first blood from the man whose orders had killed his sons and daughter. His brothers followed, then his cousins, then the women who had watched their patriarch beaten to death, each family member adding their contribution to the collective work. They kept him alive for 3 days, applied techniques that their experience had refined over the course of 20 previous killings, ensured that his final hours exceeded in suffering anything that his victims had experienced. The children who had starved had died slowly, over weeks that had given them time to understand what was happening. Crawford would die slowly too, but his understanding would be immediate, and his suffering would be concentrated into a period that felt eternal. Crawford was forced to hear accounts of each death he had caused, was told in detail about Ezekiel's final days and about the children's final weeks, was made to understand the full weight of what his raid had accomplished. He begged for mercy that no one was willing to provide, offered information and money, and anything else he thought might save him, received only the response that his victims had received when they had begged him. Nothing. His body was left at the site where the raid had begun, arranged among the ruins of the buildings that his agents had destroyed, positioned so that anyone who came to investigate would find him exactly where his crimes had been committed. The message was complete. The Tollivers had achieved vengeance that matched the crime in its thoroughness, if not in its duration, had eliminated every agent who had participated in the raid that had killed their patriarch and starved their children. The investigation that followed was the most extensive in the history of federal law enforcement in Kentucky. 21 agents had been killed over a period of 13 months, all connected to a single raid, all butchered with methods that reflected the skills of people who worked with livestock. The evidence pointed overwhelmingly toward the Tolliver clan, whose motive was obvious and whose capabilities matched what the killings had required. But no prosecution was ever successful. The family maintained the silence that mountain culture demanded, provided alibis that could not be broken, presented a united front that no investigator could penetrate. Witnesses who might have testified developed memory problems that no pressure could resolve. Jurors who might have convicted showed sympathy that reflected community attitudes about the relative guilt of the family and the agents who had attacked them. The federal government eventually abandoned its efforts to prosecute. concluded that conviction was impossible given the community's refusal to cooperate, withdrew from Rowan County with a tacit acknowledgement that the Tollivers had won. The moonshine trade resumed within months of Crawford's death, the family rebuilding the operation that the raid had destroyed, continuing the business that had supported them for 4 generations. The Tolliver clan continued in the hollow that bore their name for another 3 generations, the family eventually dispersing as the 20th century transformed the region and eliminated the isolation that had allowed them to maintain their way of life. Some descendants moved to other states, some remained in Kentucky. All carried memories of what their ancestors had done and why. The story was passed down through generations, becoming part of the family's identity in ways that pride and horror mingled. The graves where Ezekiel and the 3 children rest are still maintained by descendants who return to the hollow for annual gatherings that commemorate what happened and what it cost. The patriarch's stone bears an inscription that acknowledges his role without specifying its nature. He led his family. The children's stones are smaller, their inscriptions simpler. Samuel, Mary, Thomas, taken too soon. The words do not mention how they were taken or what their deaths provoked, leaving the fuller story for those who already know it. The site where the butcherings were conducted was demolished generations ago, the barn torn down when its associations became too heavy to bear, the location now marked only by a depression in the ground that suggests where the structure once stood. Some visitors claim to feel something unusual at the site, a heaviness that lingers in places where terrible things have happened, though such claims may reflect expectation as much as genuine experience. The legal aftermath of the case was significant, despite the failure to prosecute. The deaths of 21 agents in a single campaign prompted a complete re-evaluation of enforcement tactics in Appalachia, a recognition that the aggressive methods that Crawford had employed had provoked consequences that no enforcement purpose could justify. The Revenue Bureau reduced its presence in eastern Kentucky, adopted approaches that emphasized negotiation over confrontation, effectively conceded that the mountain communities could not be policed through force alone. The broader impact of the case extended beyond the specific reforms it prompted. The story of the Tolliver clan became a cautionary tale about the consequences of attacking mountain families, a reminder that kinship networks possessed capabilities for coordinated violence that individual avengers could not match. Federal agents who operated in Appalachia in the decades that followed were aware of the story, understood its implications, approached their work with a caution that reflected the knowledge that families would protect their own. The songs that emerged from the Tolliver story were among the most elaborate in the Appalachian tradition, their subject matter requiring verses that captured the scope of a campaign that had involved dozens of participants and claimed 21 lives. The most popular ballad told the story from beginning to end, from the Moonshine operation and the Happy Family, through the raid and the deaths it caused, to the campaign that had answered 4 deaths with 21. The first verse described the Tollivers as they had been before the tragedy, a clan whose 60 members lived in harmony in a hollow that bore their name, whose moonshine operation had supported them for 4 generations, whose patriarch had guided them with wisdom that earned respect throughout the region. The melody was warm and expansive, suggesting a world of kinship and cooperation that outsiders could barely imagine. The second verse described the children, Samuel and Mary and Thomas, whose brightness had brought joy to a family that treasured its young, whose futures had seemed limited only by the economic realities of a region that could not provide the opportunities they deserved. The melody became tender here, the notes carrying the affection that the family felt for its youngest members. The third verse described the raid, Crawford leading his agents into the hollow, the destruction of the stills and the supplies, the beating that killed Ezekiel while his family watched. This verse was difficult to hear, its melody dropping into minor keys that suggested violence that exceeded any law enforcement purpose. The fourth verse described the winter that followed, the starvation that the raid had imposed, the deaths of the 3 children one by one as their small bodies gave out. This verse was the hardest of all. Its melody barely audible, its lyrics creating images of suffering that listeners found almost unbearable. The fifth verse described the planning, the family gathering to determine how the vengeance would be achieved, the decision to butcher the agents as they might butcher livestock, the commitment to reach every man regardless of where he had fled. The melody shifted here, becoming darker and more purposeful, suggesting a determination that would not be deflected. The sixth verse described the campaign itself, the 21 agents falling one by one, the butchering that made each death a statement about what had been done to the family, the year of systematic killing that had dismantled the enforcement apparatus of eastern Kentucky. The melody had a relentless quality here, the rhythm steady as a march, the notes suggesting inevitability that nothing could prevent. The seventh verse described Crawford's death, the final victim brought back to the hollow where his crimes had begun, the 3 days of suffering that the family had imposed before allowing him to die. The melody reached its darkest point here, the notes suggesting satisfaction that was indistinguishable from horror. The final verse described the aftermath, the family's resumption of normal life, the generations that had followed carrying memories of what their ancestors had done. The melody resolved into something approaching peace, felt a peace that carried the weight of everything that had been lost and everything that had been done in response. Musicians who performed this ballad reported that audiences responded with a complexity that reflected the story's scope. There was horror at what the Tollivers had done, 21 men butchered over 13 months in ways that the songs could only suggest. But there was also recognition of what had been done to them, understanding that the deaths of Ezekiel and the 3 children had demanded response according to values that the mountain people still honored. Another song focused specifically on the butchering method, describing in general terms the techniques that the family had employed, the skills that their agricultural work had provided, the application of those skills to purposes that their development had never intended. This song was darker than the main ballad, its verses almost clinical in their implications, its melody suggesting professional competence applied to terrible ends. A third song told the story from the children's perspective, imagining their final weeks as the starvation took hold, the confusion and fear that they had experienced as their bodies failed. This song was the most painful of the tradition, its melody barely present, its lyrics creating portraits of innocent suffering that demanded response. A fourth song celebrated the family's unity, the coordination that had allowed 60 people to participate in a campaign that lasted 13 months without anyone breaking the silence that protection required. This song had an almost triumphant quality, its melody suggesting pride in kinship bonds that outsiders could not break. A fifth song addressed the question of proportionality, examining whether 21 deaths could balance 4, whether the butchering method had added something to the justice achieved or had merely compounded the horror. This song offered no answers, only questions that listeners were invited to consider. The historians who have studied the Tolliver case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of clan justice in a region where kinship networks possessed capabilities that individual actors could not match. The coordinated campaign that the Tollivers conducted required resources and planning that only a large extended family could provide, demonstrated that attacking such families risked consequences that no enforcement purpose could justify. Others have focused on the economic dimensions of the case, examining how the destruction of the Moonshine operation had imposed consequences that extended far beyond the immediate damage. The raid had not merely seized illegal property, but had destroyed the family's means of survival, had imposed starvation that had killed children, had demonstrated the disconnect between enforcement policies and their human costs. The forensic analysis has examined the butchering method that the Tollivers employed, noting that the techniques reflected genuine expertise in processing animal carcasses. The consistency of the wounds across 21 victims suggested a systematic approach that had been refined through practice, methods that produced both suffering and specific results that communicated messages the family intended. The psychological analysis has examined the family's capacity for sustained violence, noting that the 13-month campaign had required dozens of people to participate in butchering, that most individuals could not have performed. The family context had apparently normalized what would otherwise have been unthinkable. The shared grief and shared purpose creating conditions under which extreme violence became acceptable and even obligatory. The sociological analysis has examined the community's protection of the Tollivers, noting that the wall of silence extended far beyond the family itself to include neighbors and business associates who had no direct stake in the outcome. The community understood that the federal government had killed a patriarch and 3 children through its enforcement actions, believed that the family's response was proportionate to the provocation, refused to cooperate with an investigation whose success would have meant punishing victims for responding to victimization. The legal analysis has examined the failure to prosecute, noting that the case demonstrated the limits of federal authority in communities that were determined to resist it. The evidence against the Tollivers was overwhelming, the pattern of killings undeniable, the connection to the raid impossible to miss. But conviction required community cooperation that was not forthcoming. Witnesses willing to testify, jurors willing to convict, all of which the community withheld. You see, what the Tolliver clan did cannot be justified by any conventional legal or moral framework. They killed 21 men through butchering methods that were designed to inflict maximum suffering, conducted a campaign that lasted more than a year, involved dozens of participants in violence that the law could never sanction. The fact that their victims had participated in actions that killed their patriarch and starved their children does not eliminate the fact that they took 21 human lives in response to 4. And yet their story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of murder that teaches only the obvious lesson that killing is wrong. Their patriarch had been beaten to death while his family watched. Their children had starved over weeks because agents had destroyed the food that would have sustained them. Their entire means of survival had been eliminated by men who faced no consequences from a legal system that protected them. The system that should have limited enforcement to proportionate measures had instead allowed destruction that was itself murderous, had made clear through its protection of the agents that mountain lives meant nothing when weighed against federal revenue concerns. The butchering method that the Tollivers employed adds dimensions to this story that distinguish it from individual acts of vengeance. The family applied skills developed for agricultural purposes to the destruction of human bodies, transformed knowledge meant for livestock into instruments of death, demonstrated that the capabilities of mountain life could serve purposes that their development had never intended. The method communicated contempt for the victims, reduced them to the status of animals being processed, achieved a degradation that simple killing could not have matched. The question of whether their response was proportionate is one that the community answered through its refusal to cooperate with prosecution. 4 Tollivers had died because of the raid. Ezekiel through direct violence, Samuel and Mary and Thomas through the starvation that the destruction of their food supply had imposed. 21 agents had died in response, each death a statement about the value of the lives that had been taken, each butchering a communication about the contempt in which the family held those who had killed their patriarch and their children. The descendants of the Tolliver clan still gather annually in the hollow where their ancestors lived, maintain the graves where Ezekiel and the children rest, carry memories that have been passed down through 4 generations. Some descendants are proud of what their ancestors did, viewing the campaign as evidence of family strength and family loyalty. Others are troubled by the brutality, questioning whether any provocation could justify what was done in response. Most hold both feelings simultaneously, the pride and the horror existing side by side, as they do in any honest assessment of the story. The story of the mountain executioners endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of kinship bonds that proved stronger than any law, of a family that united to avenge wrongs that the legal system would not address. It is the story of skills applied to unexpected purposes, of agricultural knowledge transformed into instruments of death, of methods developed for livestock turned against human targets. It is the story of a community that chose to protect its own, rather than cooperate with authorities whose actions had proven murderous. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand at the graves of Ezekiel and the 3 children, to read the inscriptions that promise they were taken too soon, to contemplate the campaign of vengeance that their deaths provoked? Would you walk through the hollow where the Tollivers lived? Would you seek out the depression that marks where the barn once stood? Would you try to understand how a family becomes capable of what this family did? The journey to Rowan County is easier now than it was in 1892, the roads paved, and the connections to the outside world more numerous than they were when the Tolliver clan butchered 21 revenue men who had killed their patriarch and starved their children. But the mountains remain, ancient and patient, holding their memories close like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. The graves of patriarchs and children rest in those mountains, and the stories of those who avenged them echo still through hollows that have witnessed both crimes and their answers. The mountains keep their secrets, but not this one. The story of the mountain executioners has been told and retold through generations, passed from parent to child, sung in ballads that still bring shivers to those who hear them. It is a story about what happens when the government kills a family's patriarch and starves their children, when 60 people unite to achieve vengeance that no individual could accomplish, when the skills of mountain life are turned against those who violated the mountain code. It is a story that forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about kinship and violence, about proportionality and justice, about what any family might do if agents destroyed their livelihood and watched their children starve. And that, my friend, is the true story of the mountain executioners, of the Tolliver clan who butchered 21 revenue men over confiscated moonshine, who answered 4 deaths with 21, who conducted a campaign of coordinated vengeance that lasted 13 months and ended with the leader of the raid dying in the hollow where his crimes had begun. A story of family bonds and family fury, of butchering skills applied to human bodies, of a patriarch and 3 children whose deaths demanded response that an entire clan provided. The mountains remember, and through them, so do we all.